Thanks everyone for bearing with us as we changed over. You know, the silence that follows a film like this is always very heavy, and that's rightfully so. So I thank everyone for not just sticking with us for this panel, but also for sitting with that weight for a few moments. So if I could have all of our panelists please join me up on stage. I'll just start with some introductory remarks, and then I'll introduce our panelists. I think it almost feels a bit trite to say we're living through incredibly heavy times, and it feels jarring to see a film like this depict what we all know to be a real event, and one that's all too common in this country. Even though this film was released in 2019 and the actual homicide of Kenneth Chamberlain took place in November 2011, this incident is not a relic of the past. Just last week in New York, we saw the police seriously wound Jabez Chakrabarty, a young man in Queens who was in the midst of a mental health crisis when he was shot by NYPD. It's also reminiscent of a similar incident in March 2024 when Wynn Rosario was shot and killed by NYPD at home while clutching a pair of scissors after calling 911 for help during his own mental health crisis. In both incidents, the officers, obviously the Jabez's incident was just recently, but in both incidents, the officers were not criminally charged. I'm sure that there's still a review of body camera footage going on in the Chakrabarty case. But these incidents are a reminder that we continue to send police armed with guns into situations that could otherwise be addressed with clinical or social services. And the more we continue to do this, the more we will see that those in crisis, and too often many who aren't actually in crisis, like Mr. Chamberlain, experience harm and suffering. But this doesn't have to be our reality. And there are many jurisdictions around the country that are starting to understand that there are options for us to reimagine crisis response holistically. One such option is sending non-uniformed clinicians, social workers, mediators, EMTs, or victim service providers, dispatching them through the usual 911, 311, 988 numbers. These programs, called alternative response, or at least is how we refer to them, are already in operation in various forms and in various jurisdictions around the country, including here in New York City. My organization, the Policing Project, which is based here at the law school, as Dean McKenzie mentioned, has been pushing for years to support and scale these kinds of programs with some success, working in jurisdictions like Minneapolis, Chicago, San Francisco, and a few others. Last year, we hosted our second annual alternative response convening, which brought together practitioners, researchers, elected officials, and other community leaders who are actually doing this work of getting the right responses to the crisis calls that come in. But technical assistance and policy is only part of the battle. The film also reminded us that the law often lags behind human needs. Addressing crises and injustice holistically really does require a multidisciplinary coalition of support. It requires lawyers and law students to engage in zealous advocacy. It requires storytellers who humanize the lived experiences of our community members, and it requires those community members to refuse to be silent in the face of injustice. And so in the spirit of refusing to be silent, I am thrilled now to have the opportunity to speak with some of the people who are fighting this very battle from every angle. We have an impressive array of panelists, and I'll start by just saying a word of introduction about each of them so you know who they are before we jump into questions. And as Dean McKenzie put it, if I gave their full bios, we'd be here all night, so you'll get an abbreviated version, and you have to excuse the brevity. You all sat in an order that I did not expect, but you sat in the right place. So we'll start with Vincent Sutherland, who is the faculty director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law, and an associate professor of law at NYU. He teaches the Criminal Defense and Reentry Clinic, as well as a seminar on race and the criminal system. Professor Sutherland's expertise centers on racial justice, civil rights, and the criminal legal system. Laurie McCreary, to his immediate left, is the CEO of Revelations Entertainment, a production company that she and actor Morgan Freeman founded in 1996 with a mission to produce entertainment that reveals truth. In addition to this film, her credits span topics such as the American Civil War, a groundbreaking documentary about cancer, and the hit series Madam Secretary. Kenneth Chamberlain Jr. is a community activist, motivational speaker, and co-founder of the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform. He has been fighting for accountability for his father and his family and his community for the last 15 years. Mr. Chamberlain has turned personal tragedy into a movement that demands accountability, transparency, and reimagining of how police interact with communities. Frankie Faison is a legendary actor with a career spanning over 4 decades of Broadway, film, and television. He's appeared in a number of films and TV series, including The Wire and Coming to America. Mr. Faison's work in this film, where he played the lead role of Kenneth Chamberlain Sr., earned him a Gotham Award and an Independent Spirit Award nomination. Mayo Bartlett is a criminal defense and civil rights attorney. He's the principal attorney of the law offices of Mayo Bartlett and previously worked at the Westchester County District Attorney's Office for more than 10 years, serving as chief of bias crimes. Mr. Bartlett was also an attorney for the Chamberlain family. Earl Ward is one of New York's most successful trial lawyers with 40 years of experience as a criminal defense and civil rights attorney, where he represented the family of Tamir Rice, among others. He is a partner at Emery Chelly Brickenhoff, I'm not going to say all the rest of those names, and a former commissioner of the Civilian Complaint Review Board. And last, but certainly not least, we have David Meidel, who's the director and writer whose work is defined by a deep commitment to telling the stories of those often overlooked by society. His debut feature film earned a Prism Award for its honest portrayal of a family living with autism. And as the director of this film, he's been recognized with a number of awards and nominations. And my name is Max Markham. Yeah, please, let's clap for the panelists. And my name is Max Markham. I'm the executive director of the policing project here at NYU Law School. I'll also note that we've got 3 NYU alums here on the stage, Mr. Faison, who graduated from NYU Tisch, as well as Mr. Ward and myself, who graduated from NYU Law School. So that's the Dean McKenzie plug. He'll be happy that I plugged the alums. So let's dive in. I'd like to pick up right where the film leaves off. The very end of the film highlights a number of facts that are, quite frankly, egregious additions to Mr. Chamberlain's story that we saw portrayed throughout the film. Kenneth Chamberlain accidentally triggered his medical alert pendant at 5:22 a.m. on November 19th, 2011. By 7 a.m., he was dead. There's a myriad of others, but I won't read them all. I think they're important to keep in mind as we transition into a discussion on some of the legal and policy battles undertaken in the aftermath of Mr. Chamberlain's killing. So I want to start there. But of course, everyone should feel free to jump in to any question, because there's so much knowledge on this panel. But I'll start with Mayo Bartlett. As one of the attorneys for Mr. Chamberlain, can you give us a bit of background and context about the White Plains Police Department and the steps that you and the plaintiffs took towards accountability?
Yes, good evening. I think that most of us would probably be surprised to learn that many police departments in New York State, and we're not talking about a smaller state or poorer state, the Empire State, are not accredited. So for the attorneys here, if we're not accredited, that means we can't practice law in the state of New York. In the state of New York, only 25% of the police departments are accredited. So think about that. That means that as you leave New York City and you head north and maybe you head west, you don't really know if that department's going to be accredited. In fact, it's more likely than not that it will not be accredited. In Westchester County, which is one of the wealthiest counties in the United States, only 50% of our police departments are accredited. And if you stop to think about accreditation, that's the bare minimum, minimal standards. So people who get a driver license met the bare minimum standard. You probably don't want those people on a racetrack. You probably don't want those people driving an ambulance or a police car. And I think that informs what you've seen tonight when it comes to the White Plains Police Department, certainly at the time in 2011. So even though that was an accredited department, what did that actually mean? So since then, Ken Chamberlain and I have served on the Westchester County Police Task Force for Reimagining and Reforming Police. I was one of the co-chairs. Mr. Chamberlain played an integral part on several of our committees and came up with ways that we can look at how policing can be different. Directly as a result of Ken's suggestion, actually, Westchester County now has Project Alliance, which reimagines how we respond to mental health crises. But sometimes mental health crises, and in the case with the White Plains Police Department in 2011, are created by the response. So most of us, when you call 911, you don't expect, if it's a medical call, that you're going to get the police. If it's fire, you don't expect it's going to be the ambulance. And you expect you're going to get the appropriate professionals that are there. Here Actually, there was an ambulance that came. There were EMTs that came who were prevented 100% from interacting, giving any aid to Mr. Chamberlain. They were kept at a distance. Well, why would that be the case? And it didn't become a matter where there was any type of a mental health emergency until almost an hour after the police were there banging on the doors, threatening Mr. Chamberlain. So you don't expect that's what you're going to get. I will tell you that what we've done is we've spent a lot of time trying to foster best practices in law enforcement, procedural justice, trying to make sure that we look at the candidates, because not every person should be a law enforcement officer. You may be a great person for other things, but you may not be the person who can interact. And you saw circumstances where different people had different tactics and received a different response in the film. There's no difference there from what happened actually with respect to Mr. Chamberlain. I'll take this moment just also to thank Mr. Chamberlain, who's one of my dearest friends, I can say, in this world. I have more respect for him than I can articulate, because each time we watch this film, it's reliving what happened. And he always says that Frankie plays his father as if he was his father. So when he hears him speak, literally it channels in him conversations his father would say. And you could hear, when you actually heard Mr. Chamberlain in the film, and you could hear Frankie, they sound exactly the same. So it's a tremendously powerful experience, but I can't imagine what it takes to see that and to relive that each time. And beyond that, to be the person that Ken is, because he has dedicated his time toward working with law enforcement, despite all of the things that happened, despite the fact that the first time we heard the N-word being used was in the DA's office, and we were the only ones who could hear it. Somehow the prosecutor was not able to hear that word. And we had to say, wait, go back, what was that? So White Plains, in many respects, is not very different than other municipalities. Think as you drive around, wherever you are, whether you're here or outside of New York State, hey, what is the standard for policing in this state? You know, what is the protocol for mental health calls? What is the protocol for just general interaction with people? And we really don't know. So we think that there should certainly be uniform standards across the board for law enforcement, and in our estimation, in my estimation, certainly licensing for police.
Thank you. And could you just maybe say a word about sort of piecing together some of the subsequent actions from, you know, the investigation that was done and the lack of criminal charges that were filed, and then, you know, going in through the civil lawsuit? Just sort of give us a brief overview of what that looked like. And how
Absolutely. Thank you. So we were hoping that there would be criminal charges, at least against some of the law enforcement officers. And we were given the impression that there was an investigation and that would be a full and fair investigation, and that would involve speaking to witnesses, looking at footage. We had Life Aid, which literally carried almost all of the interaction. We could hear the audio of that, except for maybe a minute before the shots were fired. And we also had some body camera, and we had tasers, because the taser records audio and video. And I'm the former chief of the bias crime unit for the DA's office, so I was on the hate crimes task force for the Hate Crime Act of 2000. So I worked with, at the time, it was State Senator Patterson before he became Governor Patterson, before the Hate Crime Act of 2000, which is New York State's Comprehensive Hate Crime Act, was signed into law in Westchester at Manhattanville College. One of the issues for me was that there was no point for racial slurs to have been hurled toward Mr. Chamberlain. In my estimation, that really made you wonder what the intent of the officers were. And it also makes you wonder, as was stated in the film, why would you agitate a person who you think has a medical condition, who has advised you has a heart condition? So if nothing else, simply that behavior alone could have triggered a larger medical emergency, presuming there already was one. So there was a presentation to the grand jury. Unfortunately, we don't know what that presentation involved. We have been attempting to get the grand jury minutes. We have not been provided those grand jury minutes under secrecy. And I think that as we look at what's going on in the world right now, just looking at the Epstein files, it makes you wonder how much secrecy we really need. I think we're a mature enough society to not require secrecy unless necessary. If there's a protective order needed to get a witness to testify, that's one thing. But if it's just police witnesses, what are we actually hiding? So one of the issues for us is we don't know what the grand jury was ever given to consider. And so, for instance, if the only thing they were given to consider was murder in the first degree, let's say, or murder at all, where we're saying it's an intentional act, well, we don't necessarily suggest that the police went there with the intent to murder Mr. Chamberlain that morning. So it would make it very hard for a grand jury to come back with an indictment there. However, if they were given a full suite of charges to consider, let's say everything from the aggravated harassment. It doesn't have to necessarily even be the felony, the aggravated harassment for using the racial slur, all the way down to, let's say, a criminally negligent homicide for creating circumstances which led to his death based upon their criminal negligence, to possibly a manslaughter, possibly recklessness. In the actual case, you can hear Mr. Chamberlain saying, hey, why do you have your guns drawn? And that's a logical question. If you're possibly in need of medical assistance, you may wonder, why do the police have their guns drawn? So that ultimately did not lead to any criminal charges filed. We filed a federal civil rights lawsuit, and at that federal civil rights lawsuit, we were prevented by the judge from letting the jury know that there was a racial slur that was used against Mr. Chamberlain. So that sanitizes it quite a bit. We were prevented from arguing that there was no basis for the police to break down Mr. Chamberlain's door and enter his home. So we were prevented essentially from arguing any constitutional arguments dealing with what happened with Mr. Chamberlain. And then the jury was instructed that they could only consider 1 second prior to the final shot being fired. And so I believe we tried the case for probably 2 to 3 weeks. I can't remember anymore, but I think it was roughly a 3-week trial with probably 15 witnesses, maybe 20 witnesses. And after that, they came back with a verdict against us. And then we were immediately contacted by jurors who said that they felt that the judge had tied their hands. We appealed. We were one of roughly 5% of the cases that succeed on appeal. And our case is actually used now to overcome cases where there are qualified immunity challenges, where someone's saying, well, if you can find virtually any police officer that might have engaged in this conduct, the conduct's okay. The Second Circuit said that it was granted prematurely, and also that we should have been able to argue that there was no basis for the police to force their way into Mr. Chamberlain's home. And again, you I don't believe necessarily saw that in the film, but Mr. Chamberlain did initially show his face. He did tell them, hey, I'm okay. So at that point, one of the things that police now can do, well, they could have done it then, but that we now stress is that if somebody declines medical attention, simply document that. In particular, if you're not by yourself, but if you have, 3 or 4 other officers or another officer, document that medical attention is refused, and then you hope the best for that person, but at least you're not the reason that that person has additional harm. So I'm sorry, and so after that, after the appeal, we were able to settle the case. We resolved the case. It was the largest settlement in the history of the city of White Plains. And that being said, again, I look at New York State very differently. Many of us think that we are in a very progressive, enlightened state. I have a very strong disagreement with that notion. And I would tell you that if we were in Alabama or Mississippi, in all likelihood, we would have resolved the case much earlier. Probably an officer would have been charged, and there would have been an apology that was given to the family pretty early on, and we would have resolved it. It wouldn't have taken us nearly 13 years with the threat of a second trial.
There's a lot to unpack there, but I want to sort of zoom out a little bit, because we now have the hindsight of, what year are we in, 2026? And, this occurred in 2011, certainly before George Floyd's homicide, before even Trayvon Martin's, and before Tamir Rice's, which I know, Mr. Ward, you were involved in the prosecution of, or the criminal case, civil case for Tamir Rice. So I'm just thinking about the sort of, in 2011, how did you go about not just translating into the actual legal court, but how did you go about thinking about this through the lens of the court of public opinion, so to speak? And I think, all of the feedback from the lawyers on this panel, I think you can all jump in with your, related experience. But I think particularly for Mr. Bartlett, I'd love to hear how you were thinking about getting attention, for lack of a better word, to something like this.
We were truly blessed. We had a wonderful team, starting with Kenneth Chamberlain and going through with my fellow attorneys. We had Randy McLaughlin and Deb Cohen, Wali Muhammad, and then we had a team from Covington that joined us later, and each person was phenomenal. Wali Muhammad had a contact at Democracy Now!, and Amy Goodman invited us to go on to Democracy Now!. Mr. Chamberlain, even though he's my age, I'll say a little bit older than me now by a few weeks, but anyway, he's still proficient with social media. So we went into Democracy Now!, and I think by the time we left, we had roughly 50,000 people that had started to follow the story. And then what's amazing to me is that after that, we were on a number of different shows, probably about 10 appearances on Democracy Now! We've had multiple appearances on CNN, on other platforms, international platforms, Christiane Amanpour, and you name it. And despite all of that, New York Times, despite all of that, there are people who live in Mr. Chamberlain's building who don't know what happened to this day. And there are people who will tell us to this day that we need to focus our attention on something that's happening 2,000 miles away, 1,000 miles away, and have no idea. And that's just the nature of how we are able to share information. So today it's much better because I think today you can get things via social media easier. But it's amazing to me that even despite the film and despite a screening in White Plains, there's still people who don't know about it. And when we mention, hey, did you know about Kenneth Chamberlain? People have no idea. So sometimes it's easier for us to talk about things and to address things that have happened far away from where we live than it is to address things that happen at home.
Yeah, very well said. I want to look to Mr. Ward and Professor Sutherland as well, just to sort of drill down on the context of the time, and I guess to reflect back on what in the years since 2011 and since Tamir Rice in 2014, what's changed? What has changed in terms of the prevalence and success of criminal or civil cases for police violence?
Vince, you want me to go first?
Sure.
All right. Nothing's changed.
Took my answer.
I've been doing this for 40 years now. And the idea of criminal accountability, the idea that cops can be held accountable in criminal courts, it just doesn't happen. There are so many cases in the past that we've seen where police officers have engaged in serious misconduct, police killings, and there is absolutely no criminal prosecution. You can go as far back as 1999, Amadou Diallo, 41 shots, he was hit 19 times. There was a prosecution in that case, but four cops were acquitted. In the Tamir Rice case, the case that I handled with the other lawyers at my firm, we pushed really hard for criminal accountability. We had a situation where Samaria, his mother, and you talk about, who allows this to continue, to keep it alive, to keep it, in the public conscience. It's the family, it's the mother. And so she was a fighter, and she wanted accountability for the death of her 12-year-old son. And what we found was the district attorney's office in Cleveland, in Cayuga County, they put in the grand jury witnesses, experts, who described the shooting as justified. So you don't have a fair process when it comes to police shootings. You don't have a fair process. The district attorney's offices in these cases, wherever it happens, they're not looking to prosecute these cops. It just doesn't happen. What they're looking to do is to absolve them of any kind of liability. So criminal prosecution just simply doesn't work. It didn't work in the days of Amadou Diallo. It doesn't work now. A few years ago, I had a case of a man who was in the midst of a mental health crisis, right around, not far from here, blocks from here. Payman Bahaduran came out of his home. Again, he was in the midst of a mental health crisis. He had a knife. He walked into a bodega, and there were two officers in the bodega. They handled it entirely improperly. The clerk at the bodega saw him with the knife, and he demanded cigarettes. And the clerk said, "Put the knife down, and I'll give you the cigarette." And so he puts the knife down, and the clerk grabs the knife, and he's no longer armed. He walks out of the bodega, and he pushes an officer. And he's not armed. He has a water bottle in his hand. It's broad daylight. Responding officers come along, and they shoot him and paralyze him. No prosecution, no discipline, no accountability whatsoever. So you don't have, when you say how things change, they really haven't changed. There's no accountability in the sense that there's no criminal prosecution. District attorney's offices work with these cops. They're not looking to put these cops in jail. And so what we resort to, and which I can talk about later, is the Civil Rights Act. It's in Section 1983. It's really the only way in which you can get accountability these days. And it's not the type of accountability that where someone is being prosecuted. It's accountability where there's compensation, which is clearly not enough. And at no time ever will an officer have to come out of his or her pocket to pay for the damage that has been done. And whether it's someone who's shot, someone who's paralyzed, someone who's beaten up. So again, it's nothing's changed.
I have a follow-up, but you want to jump in?
I mean, I think the only thing I'd say is I agree 100% with Earl that really nothing has changed, and I think to the extent that things have changed, I think things have gotten worse. And you know, I'm deeply grateful to everyone who does the work to try and hold police accountable for the sort of behavior that they engage in. But I think if we look at the kind of arc of history and our experiences and our understanding of how they operate, it doesn't feel to me like an institution that can be reformed or repaired or fixed in any way. My general view is that police operate with a warrior mentality, and they operate with the same mentality that those who rounded up enslaved people in like the 1840s and 1830s and 1820s operated with. They operate with a mentality of domination and with a mentality of overpowering people and demonstrating their authority. And that is not an institution that I think can secure our public safety. That's not an institution that I think can change course in terms of how they behave. Lawsuits may bring some measure of closure and accountability for individual officers, but I don't see the legal system as stopping the sort of violence that these folks engage in and day out. I mean, you look at what's happening right now with people being kidnapped off the streets by armed masked entities of the state. Like, all of them should be subject to some sort of accountability, but none of them care because they know either nothing's going to happen to them or whatever happens to them is not going to matter because they're going to continue to doing what they want to do. So to me, and I don't have kind of a perfect answer with respect to what to do about that, but I just don't see this as something that can be reformed or fixed. I mean, I want to have faith that it can be. I understand that we need people to help, need people to call when something goes wrong, but these folks ain't getting it right. These folks are not the answer, to my mind.
One thing that we did discuss with Westchester in terms of police reform was requiring police officers to indemnify the municipality. So if they're found to have engaged in wrongdoing that was not negligent, if you make a mistake, I think we have to allow people to make an honest mistake. But if it goes beyond that, if it's intentional or reckless, that yes, we want the municipality to be responsible, okay? But then we want them also to be able to come back and say to that officer, your conduct was unbecoming, it was not what you're trained to do, it was not reckless, it was reckless or it was intentional, and we can now claw that money back from you. So that can come out of your pension. Okay, now if that's the case, then people will have skin in the game, and then you start to think about it, and then some of the officers that were in that film would have said, hey, wait a minute, whatever's going on here, we're not doing that. I'm not losing my pension. Okay, so they'll prevent you from doing that. And then Georgetown Law School also had something called ABLE, which is Active Bystandership for Law Enforcement, which came out of the atrocities after Hurricane Katrina. And there it empowers the lowest ranked officer to take action, even if it's the chief who's the one who's in need of correcting at that moment. And so that is a potential model, but it has to be legislative. And unfortunately, then we have home rule where each department really is responsible for the protocols, but looking at unified, uniform protocols and training, making sure that every department's accredited. Also looking at Tamir Rice, well, the officer who shot Mr. Rice, who was 12 years old and playing with a toy gun and got shot within, 3 or 4 seconds of this guy's arrival.
2 seconds.
Right, well, that officer had been removed from a prior department because he was found not to be able to process his thoughts, particularly when it came to the use of force. And what does he do? He kills a 12-year-old kid. And that's not casting an aspersion on him, saying he's a bad person. It's just saying he's not well-suited to be a police officer.
I just wanted to just add one thing. When we talk about police officers being held accountable by virtue of having to pay damages, what happens is they have to make a contribution, and oftentimes that contribution is like $1,000. It's crazy. Years ago, I had a case up in Harlem. Police officer took a radio, threw it, killed a man, Kenneth Banks, and the city settled the case and demanded that the officer pay something. He paid $500.
I think if we're looking at a change in legislation that would require them to be responsible for the total claim. So whatever the claim was, if the claim is $10 million, now the city can come back and take a percentage of your salary, maybe forever, until you start to pay part of that back. With the understanding most police are not going to pay it back in full, but it does at least make them think about their conduct, and they realize that there'll be a real consequence that they actually have to deal with.
I want to come back to the sort of what can other folks do to get in, because you're talking about policy solutions and proposing bills and, the legislative and regulatory frameworks, and I think that's advocacy that necessarily needs public buy-in as well. So I want to come back to that. But Professor Sutherland, you just touched on what's going on in Minneapolis and a lot of other jurisdictions, and something that I with federal takeovers and ICE being in cities and snatching folks. And one of the things I can't help but be cynical about is when I hear the policy solutions being proposed for accountability involving body cameras being added to ICE or whatever federal law enforcement. And so, but I do think that's relevant to, especially at the end of the film, we heard the audio, we saw, I think, some of the body camera footage. So, and certainly other tools of technology, many of which I'm personally very skeptical of. But I guess I just want to open it up to all of the lawyers again to just comment on where you see those tools maybe having had an impact, like audio or body cameras, and where they've fallen short.
I think on the body camera front, there was a lot of hope and optimism, particularly after Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, that body-worn cameras would actually help to hold police accountable, because to be able to see how they're engaging with the public and what they actually did on each kind of incident of any concern. But the reality is, and as far as I know, the cameras have not stopped the police from abusing people and from being violent to people. They haven't slowed down the speed with which they engage individuals with disrespect and harming folks. I think there's a value in surveilling the police and watching them, right? But the tools of surveillance can't be in the hands of the folks who are doing the most harm. Because that kind of just is like the fox guard in the hen house, right? They have control over the footage, they have control over when it's released, they have control over what it looks like, all the stuff, right? And so that's not a measure of accountability that I would want. I mean, I do think it's valuable to see all this stuff happening on camera when people in public are filming the police and watching what they're doing and engaging in that way. And I think that might be one way of trying to hold them to account and at least have a clear and accurate record of what actually happened. But to my mind, like the body-worn camera stuff is just a fallacy about that, stopping them from engaging in any sort of misbehavior or misconduct. They'll turn the camera off if they need to. They'll disconnect the camera if they need to,
I was
right?
just gonna say, there's an on and off switch on the body camera, and there's, I'm sure you've read about Messiah Nantwi. He was killed at Mid-State Correctional Facility. He was beaten to death by several officers. We're now representing the family of Messiah. There's no body cam footage because they all turned off their cameras. But what they failed to do was they failed to turn off the audio. So they're not that smart. So,
Well, there can also be, again, the law can be a remedy here because you can have policy, you can have built-in presumptions or adverse inferences, if you will, where someone will say that if your body camera is turned off, that we can have a presumption that you were engaged in misconduct. Certainly in terms of your employment, and if you are found to engage in misconduct, you shouldn't be able to, again, go from one department to another. But I will say we had a civil rights case in New Rochelle, New York, where without the body camera, we wouldn't have had much of a case. And it showed exactly what occurred. It showed the client talking in a perfectly fine manner with an officer who was outstanding officer. Officer did everything they should have done as it should be done. And then you saw another officer that was off duty run up and punch our client in the face while he's being held by two other officers. So without the body camera, we wouldn't have had that. So it's not necessarily a remedy in and of itself, but I can't really say whether it does stop some people, because I'm sure some people say, hey, I'm being recorded. Now, also that being said, we've had cases where, state troopers know they're being recorded and the language they use is astounding. I mean, I couldn't believe that they were speaking to the client in the manner in which they were, with the understanding that this might be before a jury one day or a judge, or that your supervisor might see it. But that technology, I think, is important. I think it's important. The new discovery rules are very important because these are all things we wouldn't have had not that long ago. And without it, maybe you take a plea where you shouldn't take a plea, as opposed to going to the body camera and listening to the court clerk say, hey, he doesn't look too bad to me, when the person's walking the line on a DWI case. And you can see that that person didn't fail all the things that the officer said. So that helps you to look at either the officer's ability to accurately observe or whether they're trying to mislead. So without that camera, I think that we don't get a lot of that. There certainly need to be better regulations in terms of when you can turn it on and off, and what would a sanction be if you're found to have turned it off. So there's certainly room for improvement.
I want to turn and bring in some other folks from the panel. We've got incredibly talented lawyers here, and I think we've all learned a thing or two about how to weave the story of human injustice in a courtroom. But I think there's a storytelling component that we all just saw in this film that was really tremendous, and I think translated differently via the medium of art. And so I want to start with you, Lori, and just kind of hear general sense, or as specifically as you're willing to get into it, what made you and Morgan Freeman and Revelations want to tell this story? And if you could just sort of walk us through the process of how this came to life.
Well, first of all, I just want to say I've seen this movie, I don't know, 10, 50, 100 times, and it always, seeing it with an audience, thank you for being here. There's something about seeing it with an audience, especially an audience who's not experienced it yet, that just guts me. So I'm still a little in it. So Morgan and I started Revelations because we wanted to tell stories that reveal truth. We often get involved at the very beginning of a film. This is one of the very few films that David showed us pretty much what you guys saw today. And they asked us if we would get behind it and tell people about it. and use whatever we could, Morgan's Voice, our contacts to help get it distribution and get it out there and get on CNN and the things we did. I cannot take any credit for the beautiful performances, the amazing filmmaking that David did. Frankie Faison, Morgan said to me when we saw it, he said to me, I don't think I could have done that. And that is, as we know, high praise for Mr. Freeman. Frankie, it is such a... And the other thing that just struck us was Kenneth Chamberlain Jr.'s courage to tell the story of his father and his family and put it out into the public, because as we all know, there are people that sling arrows and there are people that lift you up, and it is a very hard time, and I just want to say I'm honored to be, I get to sit next to him tonight. And to have our name associated with it, it's, we're honored, and I feel like I would like you all to hear from the people that are really smart and doing something and making a really huge difference.
Thank you, and I second the compliments of Mr. Faison. What a tremendous performance, and I'd love for you to jump in and talk a little bit about how you approached the story and how you got to know the family and how you balanced kind of the challenges and the emotional weight of portraying this kind of a story on the screen.
Yes. Hello. Thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you.
This is a very tough watch, I know. I balance things out with, first of all, I'm given material to read, to absorb, to decide whether or not it's something that I think I can shed light on and share it with an audience like yourself. I didn't meet the family until we were very, very late into the filming of it, because I kind of didn't want to, because I didn't want to do a sort of reenactment. I wanted to let the story speak for itself and let those truths be heard without interference with me trying to just mimic or reenact. So, and that's my process to work anyway. So, but when I did meet the family, as I was deep into the work of this film, it just elevated everything that I was thinking and doing even more. Because I didn't meet, first I met Kenneth and I was just like expecting one thing, but I saw something completely different. I saw a person who was very poised, a person who was very calm, a person who was very intelligent, a person who had gone through such a tragic situation with a father, losing a father like that. And rather than just be the stereotype of someone just being outraged, going out there screaming and yelling and doing all the things that you can do that cannot help, I found someone who was trying to work through the system, work through this film, work through the law, and work through everything to make his father's death meaningful. And to me, it just elevated everything that I was thinking and doing. I take off my hat to David and the whole team behind the project, because it was, to me, I believe in dealing with, I can't manifest something that's not there. And so much was there. You tell this story, you don't need a spectacular Hollywood scenario. You just tell this story. And if human beings have any kind of sensitivity or sense about them at all, they will say, wow, those feelings are there. So that was my process, to just delve in there and tell the story. And I was guided so brilliantly and beautifully by the direction of David. I mean, there wasn't interference. It was just, he said, look, this is what it is. Go to it. You go and do your work and, and just immerse yourself into this character, into this story, and we'll get what we need. And he trusted that. He trusted me. And when the other team came on, when Laurie and Morgan came on, you know, it was a no-brainer, I think, because they saw something that just was meaningful and say, yeah, okay, I want to get with this. So to me, the whole thing was just, it was educational, it was informative, it was creatively gratifying, one of the most difficult roles I've ever had to play, you know, with such longevity from beginning to middle to end. And now I get to sit on a panel with these distinguished lawyers, and I'm just like, it fills me with excitement to know that people are really working to make a difference. And that's what I try to do in my work. So I give kudos.
Incredibly well said, and you mentioned, you know, David, and I want to bring David, I want to bring you in, and I want to hear a little bit more about your process and kind of your reflections on how this turned out, and whether when you were starting, sort of entering into this film process, whether you envisioned it to look the way that it turned out, and just any reflections you have on the making of the film.
Sure. When you start, you never know. You know, the film industry is very, you know, it's very mercurial, and it's changing all the time, and you never know whether a film that you make is going to resonate with audiences or not. Despite, you know, how proud you may be of it, it may just not resonate for one reason or another. But the Kenneth Chamberlain Jr. has really been the primary voice guiding me and, you know, the entire production team through the making of the film. I was just telling him before we stepped up here that the work that he has done since the death of his father has been incredibly inspirational and really motivated me to tell this story in the most powerful way I knew how. And there were, you know, a number of different angles that I came to it from, but one of the primary reasons that this story really stood out to me was that for the past 2 decades I've worked with the disability community, with people with mental health challenges, and I am actually on the autism spectrum myself. And one of the things that is needed for professionals working with communities of people with mental health challenges and developmental disabilities and those kinds of things is very extensive crisis management training. Myself as a special education teacher, as a behavioral therapist, as a teaching assistant, I had to go through really extensive crisis de-escalation training, crisis management training, and you know, it's a certification that you receive, and you have to maintain that certification by going to follow-up courses and those kinds of things. And you know, it's not as complicated as it might seem. The basic tenet of crisis de-escalation is you need to treat an individual, whether they're experiencing a mental health crisis or not, you need to treat them like a human being. Show them the basic human respect that everyone deserves. And you know, it's been a couple of years since I've watched the film, because it officially came out in 2021, so it's been a few years since I've seen it, and it just jumped out to me so much. You know, Mr. Chamberlain was not treated with the basic level of respect that every human being deserves, and you know, it seemed very strange to me that myself, as you know, somebody working with communities of people with mental health challenges and the disability community, if I had to go through really extensive crisis management training, crisis de-escalation training, why aren't police officers expected to do the same? And some of the attorneys might be able to speak more accurately to this, but as far as I understand, I think it mentioned somewhere in the documentation that in White Plains, maybe the officers had an hour or two of training in mental health in their initial police academy training, but that I don't know if they had to go through refresher courses or anything like that. But that's really what stood out to me when I first read about this story, was the fact that, I kept thinking back to all of the crisis management training, de-escalation training that I needed to go through, and the maintenance of that certification, going to follow-up courses, all of those kinds of things. And it just stood out to me so powerfully how Mr. Chamberlain was not treated with the basic level of respect that every human being should be treated with, whether or not they're experiencing a mental health crisis.
It's well said, and I think not only was he not treated with respect, but something that stood out to me in the second watch was all of the different, I actually wanted to start documenting them, but then I was like, I'm gonna get too caught up in all of this, but all of the different instances and opportunities for de-escalation that existed throughout, and they were presented in a way that was very accessible to the audience, and yet the officers took essentially none of them.
One of the first rules that you are taught in crisis management training is if you find someone who has a rapport with the individual, that person should be the person who is communicating. And there were, like you said, there were several opportunities where that could have been done, and it just wasn't.
Yeah, and that was even after Mr. Chamberlain revealed that he had a heart condition, he wasn't experiencing crisis, that he's a veteran, and the mockery that was made of subsequently. There's a couple of other parts of it that stood out to me, and I'm curious to hear particularly about the sort of sympathetic cop character, Officer Rossi. I mean, sympathetic, use that loosely, but I think fair to say.
Sure.
And was Officer Rossi a real person? Where did that come from?
Yeah, so all of for a variety of different reasons, we decided to fictionalize all of the officers, and they are really all, composite characters of, moments that we read in the documentation, the transcripts, anecdotes that we had read in the police reports from newspaper articles and documentaries that had been made about this story. So given that it is a fictional film, we decided it was most appropriate to not use any of the names of the actual officers and sort of composite them. Because I think in the real, on November 19th, 2011, I think there was as many as a dozen officers there. There were more than the 6 that we portray, but we were filming in a very small space, and for clarity from the audience's perspective, we felt it made more sense to limit the sheer number of officers and sort of composite several of them. But in the documentation, you do get the sense that many of these officers approached him in a different way. And I think somebody mentioned trying different strategies or tactics to really reach Mr. Chamberlain. And we wanted to reflect that because, myself, having worked in the fields that I've worked in for the past 2 decades, I've seen and been involved in crisis situations where the situation is resolved calmly and respectfully, where everyone feels respected and valued at the end of that de-escalation process. And I've seen crisis situations spiral wildly out of control. I've seen it go both ways. So I've developed a sense of, the different strategies and tactics and the different demeanors that somebody might approach a situation like this with. And part of what I wanted to do with these composite sort of fictionalized characters was represent a variety of different perspectives and demeanors that somebody might approach a situation like this with.
If I could just add that the actor that played this sentimental or helpful police
Officer Rossi.
Officer Rossi was Enrico Natali, who was one of the producers. So he also had like a direct connection with wanting to tell the story.
Yeah, Enrico, he unfortunately couldn't be here today, but he and I were kind of the primary creative forces making the film, obviously before Laurie and Morgan and Revelations got involved. But Enrico obviously played Officer Rossi, was one of the producers, also edited the film. He and I would basically sit and edit the film together. So Enrico's contribution is really, really massive to this project.
Can I just say one thing right
Please.
quick, just before I mean, having seen this film, been on panels and all that numerous times, I think I realized today, and I think I realized it even before today, that one of the most important facets of doing a film like this for me and sharing this information with an audience is for the audience to be able to learn from it as well. For the young people, because we have a very different, varied audience out there. I see young people, elderly people, I see middle, whatever. But if case any of you would ever find yourself or a friend or family member in a situation like that, that you too will be able to execute the right kind of behavior that could maybe save a life or could help a situation. So I think it's very important for you to realize that it's not just the cameras and the law enforcement, the police and all that stuff. It's you. You have a responsibility as well to know how to de-escalate as much as possible. So that's like my passion in doing any kind of project that I do. It's for you, the audience, to learn from.
I think that also, yeah, please, let's give that. I think that also bears repeating, considering, David, what you were saying about your background. And I actually, on second watch of the film, it stood out to me when Officer Rossi said that he was previously a middle school teacher, or high school. He was a teacher, and they kind of laughed him off, and it made flippant remarks about it. And in fact, that was I'm going to say training, but experience that nearly, at least as how it was portrayed in the film, nearly prevented Mr. Chamberlain from being murdered. And then I think about Mr. Ward when you mentioned the case, around the corner of the clerk of the bodega disarming the person with the knife and giving the cigarettes or water or whatever it was, and then he left. That training or that experience didn't come from law enforcement. It came from just lived experience or being a teacher before that, something that, isn't sort of thought of as a public safety function, but it all sort of weaves into that same tapestry. So that's just to sort of emphasize what Mr. Faison was saying to the audience. I have one other question, and then I want to sort of turn it to Mr. Chamberlain and the family and the community. But another thing that stuck out to me was the idea of sort of just open the door, right? Relatively simple request on its face if you're writing it in a script or maybe even in testimony or in a lawsuit. But I think, Frankie, you did an incredible job of forcing the audience to understand why such a seemingly simple request elicits fear and warranted fear. So that first moment when the officers were saying just open the door, it was very powerful, and I wonder if you kind of felt the same way when you read the script and how you sort of brought that to life.
Well, it came more to life and more of a reality to me the deeper I got into portraying the character, and also even afterwards, the deeper we got into communications and conversations. Then it just and I have something that goes on inside me that I've always practiced as an actor. If it makes sense to me, then I need to follow that path. And I did. And then when we've had these conversations, I'm just thinking about what other options were available to you. And are you not able to have some sort of feeling about what is right and what is wrong, even in the moment? And unfortunately, that was his downfall. And, the downfall of Kenneth Chamberlain, because, then you're bringing in the mental issues and then you're bringing in the community and you're bringing in the past relationships with the police. There's so much. And it all, I tried to simplify it as much as possible and hope that it would eventually read to an audience as them understanding that he couldn't open that door. He just could not open the door. And one thing that really laid very heavily on my mind, in a conversation I had with Kenneth Jr., and people don't know about this, but it's what happened to him when he had to come and enter the scene with his father lying, on that stretcher being dead, and the things that happened, the interaction that he had with the law enforcement officers. When he told me the story, I'm not going to tell it now, but when he told me what happened, I looked at him and I'm saying, man, there are not too many people who could have endured or what you endured and move forward the way in which you did. And I mean, because they came at him and treated him as if he were less than dirt. And I just think that, I know you sit here now, you see this man, you see him sitting in now, and he's having this conversation with us all. But what it took to be able to endure that assault that came at him afterwards, with your father having gone through such an event, is like, boy, it gives me courage to want to just tell this story and to be out there and be a part of this whole situation. So that's
a better segue than I could have come up with. But I do want to say and sort of recognize the profound act of generosity by Mr. Chamberlain for joining us here and speaking about this and sharing his story. So I'd love to bring you in, and I'd love for you to start maybe just by saying a word about or just speaking to the humanity of your father's life, and talk to us about him in a way that maybe we wouldn't have seen or known from this film, if you're willing.
I honestly was sitting here saying to myself, I have to stop watching this movie. But before Kenneth Chamberlain Sr. was ever a case or a story in the news, he was just my dad. You would think that after almost 14 years, I always say I'm not gonna do it. It happens every time.
Take your time.
Thank you. When I think of my dad, a lot of different things come to mind. I'm a junior, of course, named after my father, and I would never put junior at the end of my name when I would sign it. And he would always yell at me about that. You put junior at the end of your name. And I'm like, I don't know what the big deal is. What's the I think of when I graduated high school. I was definitely in my teenage years a young man who didn't like to follow direction. I used to skip school all the time, and my father caught me, and he said to me, you want to skip school? Go ahead. You want to chase the girls? Go ahead. Let June get here and you don't graduate. So the day of the graduation, you had to get your card with your name on it. They couldn't find my card. I almost had a heart attack because all I could think of, my father's going to kill me. Because if your card isn't there, you didn't graduate. Why? My last name is Chamberlain. Why is my name down in the Z's? But they found it, and when they called my name, I always tell people out of that entire audience, I could hear my father's voice. thank God he did. You know, my dad and I, we had our struggles in our relationships, though. You know, people know that my father battled with the disease of addiction, and that was something that I just couldn't grasp. I couldn't understand. Somebody who I viewed as so strong, how could he succumb to something like that? But it forced me to go back to school and learn about substance abuse counseling, and I still didn't understand it till one of the professors said to me, look at it as a disease like cancer. It's progressive in nature. What happens if a disease is not treated? I said, you die. He said, okay. And it's like the light went on. And when the light went on, it strengthened my relationship with my father. It made our relationship that much stronger. And I remember one of my last conversations with him before he was killed was, you know, obviously it was close to Thanksgiving. I remember asking him what was he doing for Thanksgiving, where was he going to be at? And he said, you know, I'm going to come see you guys, but I got to make my rounds first. I said, okay. But then he was never here to see Thanksgiving. And I remember getting that phone call in the morning. You know, in the movie, you see it portrayed as he and I having a conversation, but I did not have a conversation with my father that morning. I actually got a phone call from a friend of mine who lives in the building. He called me and he said to me, you need to get to White Plains right away. And I asked him why. He said, the police are banging on your father's door. And I asked him, I said, well, why are they banging on my dad's door? And as he was telling me, I don't know, then all of a sudden he just yelled out, oh my God. And I said, what happened? And he said, I think they just shot your father. So I got to White Plains, and of course they had the yellow tape up and everything, and I went to an officer. I asked the officer, did they just shoot someone? He said, what? I said, well, let me be more direct. Did you just shoot my father? They asked for ID. I gave him ID. Another officer comes and tells me to go to the hospital. The hospital was right down the street. I get to the hospital, and they put me in some room that was pretty much away from everybody. And I was in there with my cousin. And I just remember the doctor coming in, and the doctor just looked at me and said, I tried. I tried to save him, but I'm sorry he expired. I asked to see my father. He took me into the emergency room area where he was working on my dad. And I tell people one of my last memories is my dad. He is. He was just laid on the stretcher with his eyes wide open. And I could see where the bullets went in him. And all I asked was, what happened? And as you heard Frankie say, when I asked what happened, one of the police officers looked at me and, excuse my language, he said, we don't have to tell you shit. So I was going to challenge him at that point, but I walked outside. And then when I walked outside, he followed me outside. So when he followed me outside, I turned around. You just killed my father, so I turned around now, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm not ready to engage you now because you just murdered my father. The next thing I know, there's 15 police officers standing around me. They're laughing at me. They're putting on motorcycle gloves that have the fiberglass knuckles. And I'm standing there, and one of my friends was with me, along with my cousin. And I said to my friend, step back. Don't get involved no matter what you see happen. And he said, why? I said, because you're going to have to tell this story. He said, why? I said, because they're going to kill me. But at that point, I really didn't care. And then I don't know what happened, but this officer just kept looking at me and he just kept laughing. And I said to him, well, if I don't get anybody else, I'm going to get you. And he looked at me and I said, do you want to? I said, but you know what? You want to know the difference between me and other people you've done this to? He said, what? I said, I'm an intelligent black man. I know how to fight you. He looked me up and down. He smiled and he said, fuck you. And when people ask me, where did my motivation come from? That interaction that I had with that officer, him telling me what I can't do, because I've always been that type of person. You tell me I can't do something, I'm going to show you that I can. You know, so my family and I, we have, you know, the loss of my dad. We've experienced other loss. You saw in the film at the end that the film was dedicated to my dad, and then you saw a female next to him in a Navy uniform. That was my daughter. My daughter passed away in 2019 in a car accident. So I lost my dad, then I lost my daughter, and then I lost my mother. So it was just back-to-back occurrences. And honestly, I can't tell you how I stayed so strong in this fight, being able to help other families, being able to create a coalition for police reform in White Plains, or have other families come to me and say they need help. But maybe that's where I get my strength from, because I go sit with them and I go talk to them and I tell them some of the things that they can expect. You know, when my father was killed, one of the first phone calls I received was from the family of Damroy DJ Henry, the Pace University student who was killed, and I believe that was in 2010. His mother called me, and she gave her condolences. She said that I am now a part of a club that she wouldn't wish on her worst enemy. And then she said to me after that, do not trust the district attorney. The district attorney is going to promise a full and fair investigation, but she's going to lie to you. It's not going to happen. Other people that I know that have been involved in this fight said the same thing to me. They said there's not going to be an indictment. They said, we're telling you now it's not going to happen. And in May of 2012, my family heard what many other families hear. After an exhaustive investigation, the grand jury has determined that there's not sufficient enough evidence to charge the officer in the killing of Kenneth Chamberlain Sr. A reporter asked the district attorney, but they called Mr. Chamberlain the N-word right before they killed him. Surely that's a hate crime. The DA said yes, they did call Mr. Chamberlain the N-word, and it should not be used, but they use it as a tactic to distract Mr. Chamberlain. So, as Frankie said, one thing that I want this film to do is, if nothing else, be a teaching tool for what not to do. unfortunately, when I look out here, I'm saying I'm preaching to the choir, you know. But, and then when you were talking about the body cameras and things like that, I go back, I think about Rodney King, you know, all the way up till now. I mean, the bottom line is accountability. I used to yell justice for Kenneth Chamberlain Sr., and I stopped because I said there's never going to be justice for my dad. So I said accountability, and then of course people say, well, what does accountability look like? You know, of course I want to see officers held accountable. I want to see them walking a perk line, getting pictures taken of them the same way I would if I would have committed an offense like that. But it's also putting laws and mechanisms in place that so that no other family will have to deal with the situation the way that I've dealt with it. You know, it forced us to start doing research. We started looking at the police academy. We started looking at mental health, not just individuals they encounter, but the mental health of the police officer. And then it's like, well, they only get psych testing when? Once? Before they get on the job? That doesn't make sense. And then when I said, well, why don't they have psych testing again? And a cop said to me, because there'd be no more cops if you did psych testing. So, but I want to thank you all for having me. I'm going to stop and defer to the legal minds now.
Yeah. We promised that there would be time for Q&A, and so I think Patrice is going to help out with some of the microphones. But I do, while you all are thinking, I think we'll have time for one very brief question. So think about what you want it to be. But I do want to ask Mr. Chamberlain, you know, and thank you doesn't even begin to explain and convey the appreciation of you sharing your story and your family's story. But I do want to ask, in an attempt to maybe end on a somewhat at least uplifting, if not positive note, you clearly have a relationship with just about everyone on this stage, and it's a beautiful thing to see. And I'm curious if there was a moment or a series of moments, whether it was with Frankie or David or Mayo, where you felt most supported. And I ask that because I think there's folks in this room who will subsequently become public interest lawyers, civil rights attorneys, et cetera, who may not, hopefully have not experienced that kind of personal tragedy, but to the extent that you can indicate to them how best to support their subsequent clients. I think that could be a powerful moment to share if you have one that comes to mind.
You know, I think that I can't recall a time that I've ever reached out to any one of them and said I had a problem or a question or just wanted to talk, and they didn't respond to me. You know, I think it's just about seeing the humanity in people that are dealing with situations like this. Understanding that when situations like this happen, that they automatically try to make the family member or your loved one look like a victim. I mean, a suspect rather than a victim. The entire time, for instance, when we were at trial, they kept referring to my father as the suspect. Mm-hmm. And I kept saying, my dad's not a suspect. Only one officer referred to my father as the victim, and that was an investigator from the DA's office who referred to my dad as the victim. But I would just simply say to people that are going to go down this road or want to involve themselves in these type of fights, just understand that they're not easy. Understand that families, that we're gonna go through this emotional roller coaster. Explain everything in detail because there's some things that we don't know. I jokingly say to Mayo all the time, I say, well, once upon a time, I couldn't tell you what a Monell claim was, but I can tell you what that is now. I can break down 50H hearings. I can break down Brady rules and Brady violations. But that's from me sitting with him and sitting with the other attorneys and them taking their time with me. It's almost you have to use childlike hands, when you're dealing with families, because this loss is great, no matter how it happens. So I'm always grateful to everyone, to David, to Mayo, to Lori, to Frankie. I would just say, this is my movie dad, I'll send Frankie an email and he'll respond right back, I couldn't ask for anything more. I mean, the team that I have around me, the village might have been small, but it was a village nonetheless. And they definitely kept me covered. And, even in those times where I thought I was really going to lose it.
Special. All right, let's do some questions. Maybe one to Patrice. You got the pick. You got the power.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
My name is Cynthia Turnquist Jones. I'm from Money Earner, Mount Vernon. When I met Kenneth, my hair was long and brown. You see it now? It's gray. And I am also now a city council member. I met Kenneth a year after. I was on the mic, rocking the mic, because my student, Ramarley Graham, was murdered by NYPD. And then Kenneth was there, and he was getting on the mic, and he was rocking the mic. And we became friends. And I want you to know that he calls it a village, but it is actually a corner of people that stand behind you, that you get a chance to call them up and cry with no feelings about it. You keep moving and you wake up the next day and you continue checking on the person. So for those who chose to go into this, he said it's never ending and you will continually be tired. But you need to keep on pushing, because the same officers that are doing this, they are in our schools. I've been an educator for 30 years now, and they're in the school and they're hungry. And they're hungry for our children. And so the things that they are doing, they start from young. And so someone like Kenneth Chamberlain and the people that he has in his corner made sure that he was able to stand up. They were his kickstand. So when you choose the person that you're going to be the kickstand for, make sure you understand that it's for a long time. I don't know how many articles I wrote about Kenneth Chamberlain with Black Westchester magazine, but I know that the squeaky wheel is the one that's heard. So when you put out your movies, when you hit social media, you have to continually hit it over and over and over again until they did like what they did to Black Westchester and shut down their whole website, and A.J. Woodson had to start over again. So continue standing tall, brother. Continue crying. And make sure that everyone knows the stories. Very important. Thank you.
That's a word. Let's do one more. Let's do a question.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Keisha Skipper, and like Cynthia and AJ Larnaz, we are a part of Kenneth Village. We drove down here from Westchester to not only support, but to also learn. And this is my third time seeing the movie, but the first time since my son enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. So that added a different component for me. And my question is, what role, if any, did our United States military have in response to what happened to someone who gave their life in service and then their life was taken?
Well, I will say that United States Marines were in touch with me. And I don't know if livid is the word that I could use to describe the things that they were saying, but they wanted to take action. And they didn't want to talk. They were like, we'll show them what real combat is. That's actually what most of the Marines that reached out to me said. They started posting what happened to my father on their sites. Even when I had to get my father's Marine uniform because he was buried in his uniform, I had to take it to the United States Marines recruiting office. They made sure everything was perfect on that uniform. But they definitely did. I wish I could have got more support from them. I wish I could have had a lot of Marines out there, current or former or retired, but it just didn't happen like that. But again, like I said, the people that I do have supporting me, I mean, I couldn't ask for anything more. They're not large in numbers, but they're consistent. And that's all that I can ask for.
I'll say also, Kenneth and I were invited to present at West Point, and I'll talk a bit about it and let Ken speak about it, but we were invited to talk to the incoming class of cadets, and we're seated with the generals to discuss accountability. And I think that to me was phenomenal. It gave Mr. Chamberlain a chance to talk to them about the fact that they're all ambassadors, whether they choose to be or they don't choose to be, and how their conduct impacts other cadets, but it also impacts each and every one of us, because when they do something that's unbecoming and we travel, well, that puts us all at risk. When they do good things, of course, you may or may not hear about it. If it's extraordinary, you might hear about it. And also one of the first people to contact Mr. Chamberlain was Andrew McLaren, who was a military officer, and also was very motivated and has been supportive. So I'll let Ken speak a bit about that as well, if you'd like.
You said it all. You said it all.
I know we have to vacate this room, and I'm trying to keep us on time. I would love to ask 100 more questions, but that is all we have time for. So please join me in extending a profound, tremendous thank you to our panelists. It is a rare and powerful thing to have the heart, mind, and voice of a movement all in one stage. So thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for your brilliance. Thank you for your bravery. I also want to quickly just thank Alyssa Ward, Lisa Boykin, Patrice Sultan, and Judy Bartlett for putting on this event. And I will now turn it over to Judy, President of the Law Alumni of Color Association and sponsor of this event, for some final remarks.
I'm just so filled up tonight with emotion and gratitude. Can you give us hope? Someone asked my son who he admired the most, and he said Ken Chamberlain Jr. And I want to thank Mayo Bartlett. It's not a coincidence that we have the same last name. He's my better half. And all the panelists, David, Earl, Frankie, Lori, Professor Sutherland. I'm an NYU alum, so I'm always going to say Professor Sutherland. And congratulations on your tenure. So as we close this evening, I just want to thank you for being part of this shared experience, by showing up, by listening deeply, and by engaging with openness and care. The film and tonight's conversation remind us that stories like Ken Chamberlain Sr.'s are not just moments in history, they are calls to reflection, accountability, and action. The evening would not have been possible without the tremendous efforts of Patrice, Max, Alyssa, and Lisa Boykin. We are deeply grateful to our co-sponsors, Krill and the Policing Project, for their partnership and support in bringing this important conversation to our community. LACA is committed to positively impacting the lives of students, faculty, and alumni at the law school, and to continue to create space for necessary conversation, spaces where law, justice, and humanity meet. We invite you to carry this dialogue forward. So before you leave, please take a moment to share your reflections with each other and keep this conversation going. Thank you again for being here and for being part of this community.